Hi, everybody. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. I am so glad that you are here for this very important conversation. I received a call about 6 months ago from Lisa DeMoore, who let me know, Gilda, this is someone you need to have on your program. And now that day is here, and I couldn't be more excited about this conversation with Jennifer Wallace, our author, and Lori Gottlieb, who has been with us before about her important book, You Should Talk to Someone. This is truly a special event. As you know, the Glenbard Parent Series is open to anyone, everywhere. Our ask of those of you that are here is to please spread the word to neighbors, wherever they may live, family across the country. Everybody's welcome. And we provide programming for children of all ages. Programming is provided in 3 languages. Programs are provided at noon and at 7 p.m. And in fact, we'll be back again at 7 p.m. Jennifer will be back, and this time she'll be in conversation with Julie Lythcott-Haims, the author of the book, How to Raise an Adult. GPS is all about inspiring and engaging families, and we know that that's exactly what will be happening today on this important conversation. Let me quickly tell you about what is upcoming. Next week, we will be welcoming, in honor of Suicide Awareness Month, Matthew Knock, who is the chairman of the psychology department at Harvard, will be talking about his important research about suicide and destructive self-harm. That will be next Wednesday, the 6th at noon and 7 p.m. And then the following week, the next night on Thursday, we'll be welcoming back Frank Palmisani, really an expert on financial aid. He'll be speaking at 7 p.m. on the 7th. And then, as I mentioned, Lisa DeMoore, she has a new book. She will be coming to talk to us on Wednesday, the 15th, and she will be talking about her brand new book, which is called The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. We're really calling this a playbook to thrive in trying times. It really is a program that you don't want to miss. So we'll hope to see you then. And then we have a program with Shelley Diglisky on Tuesday, the 19th, The Path to Loving Ourselves, Self-Compassion and Self-Care for Turbulent Times. That doesn't conclude the month. The Promise of a Pencil, a community reads, a story of how an ordinary person can create extraordinary change. Those are just some of the highlights of September. So you do want to share. And again, special thanks to the sponsors who make this all possible. I'm also very excited to welcome Amber Quirk. She is a very busy regional superintendent for DuPage County, and she will do the honors of introducing our 2 important speakers for this conversation. Amber, take it away.
Thank you, Gilda. And I am very honored to be here to introduce Jennifer Wallace, who is an award-winning journalist and an author of the just released book, Never Enough, When Achievement Pressures Become Toxic and What We Can Do About It. She's a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and she appears on national television to discuss her articles and relevant topics in the news. Wallace began her journalism career at CBS 60 Minutes, where she was part of a team that won the Robert F. Kennedy Awards for Excellence in Journalism. She is a journalism fellow at the Center for Parent and Teen Communication at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Wallace will be in conversation this afternoon with Lori Gottlieb. Lori Gottlieb is a psychotherapist and New York Times bestselling author of Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which has sold over 1 million copies and is currently being adapted as a television series. In addition to her clinical practice, she's the co-host of the popular Dear Therapist podcast produced by Katie Couric and writes the Atlantic's Dear Therapist advice column. It's an honor to welcome them both to the Glenbard Parent Series today for this very important discussion. And I will be very excited to forward any information they are willing to share with our school districts. So I will turn it over to you, Lori.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Amber. And I'm so glad to be here with Jennifer Wallace today. Jenny, your book is so important. I can say that both as a therapist and a parent. And I wanted to start off and, I think it's so relevant to what's going on in the culture. And I know you spent a number of years writing this book and researching this book. What made you want to write a book about this achievement culture and achievement pressure?
Yeah, Lori, thank you so much for speaking with me today. So in 2019, a few things were going on. One was that's when I sold the book. One was that my oldest was about to enter high school. And I thought to myself, I have 3 teenagers. I thought to myself, how should I be spending these next 4 years with him? This is the last, where should I be putting my parental energies? So that was on my mind. Also in 2019 was when the varsity blues scandal hit. If you all remember that, it was when parents from the East Coast and the West Coast got caught up in a bribery conspiracy to get their kids into highly selective schools, colleges. And I thought, how did we get to the point where parents were now going to jail to get their kids into college? And I wasn't buying the narrative that they just wanted bumper stickers. I felt like there was something deeper going on. And so I started digging in. And then the final thing that sort of led to this book was in 2019, I wrote an article for the Washington Post about how students attending competitive public and private schools around the country were now an at-risk group, meaning they were 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety, depression, and substance abuse disorder than the average American teen. And my kids go to one of these high achieving schools, as their researchers call them. And I wanted to know, what could I do in my home to buffer against the excessive pressure? So those were kind of the things that were happening in my life when I sold the book.
And in your book, you talk about what we can do. But before we get to that, I'm wondering, when I think about my cohort and your cohort of when we were growing up, and yes, there was pressure, but it wasn't like it is today. And you did so much research and you talked to a lot of people in a lot of different fields. What did you find about why things are so different today?
Yeah. So I was wondering the same thing, like you just said, growing up in the 70s and early 80s, my experience growing up was so different from my children's. And while there are several threads that we could pull at to talk about the differences, the one that resonated most with me were the changes in the macroeconomic forces of our environments. So growing up in the 70s and early 80s, like I did, life was generally more affordable. Housing was more affordable, healthcare was more affordable, higher education was more affordable, food was more affordable. And then over the last several decades, so back in the 70s and early 80s, parents could be relatively assured that their children would be able to replicate their childhoods, if not do better, right? That was the American dream, to raise your kids in America and have them do better than you. But parents today are now seeing the first generation of kids who are not doing as well as their parents. Modern parents today are seeing this ushering in of steep inequality, the crush of the middle class, hyper competition that's come from globalization, and parents are absorbing these pressures, whether we're aware of it or not. And we are, in the words of researchers, becoming social conduits and passing those fears about the future onto our kids in the way that we parent. And this is not to blame parents. This is to help parents stop personalizing the struggle, stop blaming each other, and instead kind of zoom out and put it into a bigger context, something that we are all struggling with. These macroeconomic forces are impacting all of us. So that's what I hope to do with the book, is kind of elevate this conversation beyond finger pointing and actually help parents understand the context with which they are raising their kids.
And this is interesting because it's happening everywhere. It's not just this thing that's happening on the coast. It's happening all over because parents are having the same fears. You open the book with this great anecdote about a parent whose child is on a couple of sports teams, and the parent is worried about sort of, what this child's resume is going to look like. Can you talk a little bit about that, just to make it more, I think that we all understand it in a general way, but I think the examples in the book are so relatable.
Oh, thank you so much. So the first story that I bring up is a student who at the time was a junior in a high school on the West Coast in Washington State. And she was talking about what her everyday schedule was like. And it was exhausting. It was really long hours in her after school extra. She was a varsity athlete. She also volunteered. And she was involved in several clubs. And she was telling me that, some nights she only got about 5 hours of sleep. And I said, how can you maintain your stamina on 5 hours of sleep. And she said, those are the days I run the practice laps with my eyes closed. And she didn't think that was abnormal. She, she talked about the stress, but she was kind of resigned to the fact that she was going to sacrifice whatever it took, all of her high school years, her sleep, to just keep going. And so that was a story that I heard echoed over and over again. And I heard it in the kids and I heard it in the parents. And the parent anecdote that you're talking about is a woman that I met. She had filled out, so I worked with a researcher at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for a parent survey. And I had about 6,500 parents fill out this survey talking about the pressures they were feeling. And at the end of the survey, I asked if any parents would be willing to be interviewed. And this woman was one of them. And I visited her and she said, in middle school, and it wasn't until 7th or 8th grade that she started questioning what she knew to be true about parenting. She used to think that her job was to enjoy her kids, raise them to be, these ethical future citizens of the world. And when her son, who was in one of the gifted programs, in 7th grade, the pressure from the parents started ramping up, and they were like, "Are you signing him up for this after school activity? And are you what academic summer camps are you doing?" And so she really started questioning herself as a parent, and the pressures were so intense in that home that her son actually had to be severely medicated and barely graduated high school because of the pressures. And I was, sitting and listening to this mother, and I was just wanted to comfort her, because I said, I completely understand what you're saying. I mean, parents today, as she put it, feel responsible for raising kids to be these high achievers. Maybe in the 70s and early 80s, when we were growing up, parents would feel proud, if you were achieving. Today, parents feel tasked with making their kids a success. And I heard that over and over again. Actually, in my survey, 75% of parents said that they felt responsible for their children's academic success, that they felt responsible for it. That's a lot of pressure.
One of the things that I think is great about this conversation in your book is that a lot of parents feel shame. They feel like, I don't want to acknowledge that I'm falling into this trap. And they don't want to be in it. So they're kind of always on the toggling between, I don't want to be that kind of parent, but my child will be behind if I'm not that kind of parent. You have this anecdote in the book about a student who was starting high school and was on 2 sports teams, and the parent said, "Oh, you have to do more. What are you going to do for your activities? You need a resume." And it reminded me of when my son started 9th grade and he came to a new school, and he said, "Mom," and they were 14. He said, "Mom, everybody has a LinkedIn." And they all had LinkedIns. They were already starting their resumes. And so you talk in the book about how you fell into this trap too, like we all have.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about how that happened in your family.
Yeah, I mean, I have several stories in the book of how I fell into the trap myself. One of the stories that I tell is my oldest son was entering 7th grade. And I, in starting around 5th and 6th grade, I started every fall, I'd get a little stressed about what activities is he in? Is he in too much? Is he in too little? And it felt like at the time, every parent had figured out what uniquely made their kid tick. He was friends with the soccer star. There was an amazing chess player. And I was thinking, what latent talents am I neglecting in my own kids? And so I distinctly remember this. I was sitting at my desk in New York City, and I was like, okay, he is really into architecture and design. When we travel, he's always pointing out facades. Maybe that's something I need to foster. So I started Googling intro to architecture classes in New York City, and I started calling around. I called the Cooper Hewitt, which is, part of the Smithsonian Museum collection. They're near my house in New York City. And I said, "Do you have any classes for 6th graders?" And they chuckled, and I said, "Okay, no, all right." And I kept going. And then finally one school did bite. They had an intro to architecture class, but it was really aimed at high school students and college students. But the instructor said I could sign my 7th grader up if I promised to sit next to him throughout the class. And it was going to be on evenings. And I was like, okay, great. So my son walks in that day and I say, honey, I am so excited. I have this intro to architecture class for you. Isn't this great? And he said, Mom, I love architecture. Please don't ruin it for me. So my kids have been very good about calling out when I'm too much around the pressure.
What do you think makes your kids able to do that? I think a lot of kids can't do that. And I know that you got some advice, and certainly in writing the book, you got some advice from psychologists. What was the most helpful advice, and how do you think that empowered your kids to be able to speak up?
I think in our home, we've always, I call it I live my life out loud. So my kids can hear how I think about things, how I process it, how I regulate. And I think it's because I sort of model that, that they, and I listen to them. I mean, we are a family, and I grew up this way, that very much welcomes everyone's voice. And while researching this book, I got to really understand how important it is for children, even young children, to feel like their voice is heard and that it matters and that they can have an impact on their own lives. And so, I think just honoring their voice. We don't always agree with it. We are ultimately the deciders as the parents, but we honor the voice and we honor the perspectives of our kids.
And you're not saying in the book that we don't want our kids to achieve. You even talk in the book about healthy achievers. What is the difference between a healthy achiever and maybe someone who's achieving, but they're sacrificing their own emotional and overall well-being?
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. This is very much not an anti-achievement book. I'm an achiever. I want my kids to feel the joy of achievement and the joy of pushing themselves to their limits, not health-wise, but in terms of academia and achievements. And so I went in search of the healthy strivers. I wanted to know what, if anything, they had in common. What did their parents focus on at home? What was school like? What was their relationship like with their peers? And I found a lot of threads that these healthy achievers had in common. And I get into it in depth in the book, but it boils down to this idea of mattering. The healthy strivers that I met had what psychologists would call a high level of mattering. They felt valued for who they were deep at their core, by their families, by their schools, by their communities. So they felt valued separate from their achievements. And equally important, they were depended on and relied on to add meaningful value back to their families, to their schools, to their communities. So this high level of mattering that they enjoyed, it acted like a protective shield. It didn't mean that they didn't have setbacks. It didn't mean that they weren't sometimes anxious or depressed. But what mattering did, it acted like a buoy. It lifted them up. It would help them to be resilient in the face of setbacks. The kids who seemed to be struggling the most were kids who felt like they mattered only when they achieved, only when they had a certain amount of likes, only when there was a certain weight on the scale. The other kids who seemed to be struggling were also kids who got the message at home that they mattered, but they were never relied on to add value to anyone other than themselves. And so what these kids lacked was social proof that they mattered. They heard it in words, but they didn't see it in action. And so what separated the healthy achievers versus, the unhealthy ones was that they were motivated by this kind of clean fuel, this drive to matter, to add value. And the kids who seemed to be struggling the most were often fueled by what I would call dirty fuel, meaning that it's something that a parent or a coach might use to get a short-term goal, like an A on the Spanish quiz tomorrow. So, using criticism or comparing a child to another, that's a dirty fuel that will ultimately clog a child's engine. So the healthy strivers really enjoyed this clean fuel.
When you talk about mattering, it makes me think a lot about connection. And, there's so much has been talked about lately about loneliness and the epidemic of loneliness. And I think that mattering also plays into this idea that you're connected to something bigger. And you give so many beautiful examples of mattering in the book. Can you just give a couple so people understand what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you Adam is a wonderful example of mattering. So he went to a school in Washington State. He's severely dyslexic, and was, never put into the advanced classes because they didn't want to, push his limits. And so he was actually quite bored. And one day he went on a rescue trip. He trained to be a search and rescue person. And he was tasked with locating the body of a child his age, he and his group, who had committed suicide. And that moment was a turning point for him. He decided in that moment that he was going to stop tears from getting to the point where they wanted to take their lives. And so that ignited in him this mattering. He mattered. He and the rescue crew found the boy, reunited it with his mother so she could say goodbye. And that night he signed up to train and to become a trained peer counselor on an 800 hotline. And that set him up. So not only did he feel valued, he now had a mission, which was to prevent other peers of his and actually from taking their lives. And that ignition, that his mattering was ignited so much that it actually pushed him to become a greater achiever. He decided he wanted to become an MD and to help do emergency room medicine and to help young people. And so he went from being, a really like average student to taking advanced classes, wound up going to UCLA. I followed him through high school into college, and I was on the campus with him. And I said, how is it that a child with, he described it as severe dyslexia, got himself on the pre-med track at UCLA? And he said, because I'm doing something bigger than myself. It's not about me. I don't love studying for AP chemistry and, the college level chemistry and bio, but I know that in order for me to do what I need to do in this world, I have to take those classes. And so that sense of mattering pushed him to achieve in healthy ways.
I love that because I think for so many kids, when they think about meaning and purpose, they don't have a lot of that in high school. It's all about, the purpose is to get this grade, to get into this college, to do this activity, to put it on the resume. And there's no sort of greater meaning to it, mattering, as you say. And this was something where, yeah, he might not love all those classes, but he had a greater reason for wanting to achieve in them. And we don't give our kids a greater reason other than to achieve this thing, get into this school, go on the next rung, right? But it's not something that really matters in the same way. And I think that so often, and I'd love to hear how mattering works in your household, because I think so often we tell our kids, as parents who love our kids, we'll say, how much we value our kids and how much they matter to us. But it is words. There's no sort of greater community connection or even intrinsic connection to what it means to matter other than my parents love me unconditionally. Sure, right? But then, but I still have all these pressures. So
Yes.
What does mattering look like in your house?
So mattering is really our North Star now. I used to, before researching this book, I used to solve for my kids' happiness. And, when they were not acting like themselves. But now I actually solve for their mattering. So if one of them is not, I'll give you an example of my son who spent his freshman year online school during COVID. And we live in New York City and we were out of the city during COVID. And so he didn't get to see his friends. He communicated to them on text and Snapchat and all of that, but he didn't see his friends for many, many months in person. And so when he got back to school, he was feeling a little lonely, a little disconnected. And so I remember a few weeks into in-person school, a few of his friends came up to him and said, we would love you to consider joining the baseball team because we're down one player. And for us to be able to play, we really need you. And I know baseball isn't your sport, but would you maybe be willing to consider joining? And so he came home to me after school and he's like, I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, I don't know. I want to think it through because if I join baseball, that's 2-3 hours a day after school, taking a pretty rigorous academic schedule. I don't know if that's where I should be spending my time. He said, but if I don't do it, then my friends won't be able to play. And so I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, I think I should do it. And before I researched this book, I think I would have said, you know what? Baseball's not your thing. Academics are your thing. You have other activities, put your energy there. Don't waste your energy on something that's not actually your thing. And that would have been wrong because he joined the baseball team and oh boy, did that give him a sense of mattering. He saw up close and personal that if he was not there, they would not be playing. And his teammates and classmates thanked him all the time. And actually, it created this positive upward spiral. This is not the reason to foster the mattering, but it just happened to be a great consequence. His grades actually went up. Despite the fact that he was missing 2 or 3 hours of homework, it created this positive upward spiral. That's just one story of mattering. We have lots in our house now. We do a lot on mattering.
Yeah, and I think it's so worth thinking about in our own households. There's a quote in the book that resilience rests on relationships. So this is where I think we have this epidemic of loneliness because we're so focused on the individual, like how is my child achieving individually, and not in the larger web of where are their social relationships and how do they matter in the context of these social relationships.
That's exactly right, Lori. What I learned, I had so many aha moments researching this book, but one of them was the idea that as parents, we think our ultimate responsibility is to raise independent, self-reliant adults. And that's what I used to think. And then I started looking at the healthy strivers and I saw that what their parents focused on were the skills of interdependence, meaning that they taught their kids how to rely on others and how to have others rely on them in healthy ways. And what that interdependence did is it, again, gave them social proof that they mattered, that they were worthy of being supported, and that they were able to help other people when a friend needed help.
Yeah, yeah. You have so many solutions. I would say I call them solutions, but other people might call them suggestions. But I think that a lot of us really want solutions. I think that we know that this culture is toxic and we don't know what to do. And we're looking for some concrete advice. And one of the things you talk about, you give this example with a $20 bill.
Yeah.
Can you
Sure.
talk about that? I thought that was really powerful.
So this was an idea given to me by a mother that I interviewed. So her children, she was specifically talking about 2 of her kids who were extremely high achievers and really too hard on themselves. So her job at home was to lower the temperature in her house around achievement. And here's how she did it. When one of the 2 kids would come home with a bad grade or getting cut from the A team, she'd reach into her wallet and she'd pull out a bill, a $5 bill, 10, 20, whatever she had in her wallet. And she would say to the child, do you want this money? And then she would say, wait, hang on. And then she would crumple it up. She'd put it on the floor, dirty it up, then very dramatically dunk it into a glass of water. And she would hold up this dirty, wrinkled bill. And she would say to her kid, do you still want it? And then she would get explicit. Like this $20 bill, your value doesn't change, whether you are cut from the team, whether you are down, dirty, and feel crumpled up inside. Your value is your value, no matter what. It does not change. And I thought, what a great way of making the thinking visible, right? We talk about how we love our kids unconditionally. How can we show it to them? And I thought that was a great way of making that kind of thinking visible.
Yeah, I love that idea of making our thinking visible because a lot of times we're just putting words in the air between us and the kids. And they're not always listening. They'll tune us out. They're like, yeah, mom, we know. And I think that those powerful illustrations, where it's visual, where you're doing something that's just not talking to them. I think as parents, we end up using too many words I always say when we're talking to our kids, ask yourself, like, why am I still talking? Right? We can go on and on and on, and they've tuned out after sentence two. So I love that example. Another thing you talk about is getting a PhD in your kid.
Yes. So Rick Weisbord, who's at Making Caring Common up at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, said to me a few years ago, the self becomes stronger, less by being praised than by being known. So what a lot of these kids that I met and interviewed talked about was how praise felt like pressure. And so better than praising is what I call getting a PhD in your kid, meaning seeing their strengths, seeing what makes them uniquely tick. That is critical. That is a critical ingredient to mattering. What makes them different? What makes them strong? What are the strengths they can bring to the world? And I think a lot of us as parents, we don't often see the strengths because it's so inherent in who our child is. So there are a few strategies parents can do to really notice their kids' strengths. One of them is they can go on actually the matteringmovement.com website. I co-founded this nonprofit. It's the action arm of the book. And we have something called the VIA survey, which there's a parent version and a kid version. It's a 10-minute free survey that was formulated by Marty Seligman at Penn and Christopher Peterson at Michigan, the grandfathers of positive psychology. And it points out your 5 core strengths. And I think you can print it out. And I think it's just a great way as a family to talk about what you see in your children as their strengths. A couple of other ways to point out these strengths is ever since Rick Weisbord told me that phrase about, our kids needing to be known, every birthday we go around the table and we say one thing we love about the birthday boy or girl. And it's never that you got an A in English. It's always something that's inherent to them, their great sense of humor, that they're so caring. And then a third way that you can notice your kids' strengths, I find teachers are such a great resource. And so many teachers today write these narratives. And so what I've taken to doing is highlighting and annotating my kids' narratives. When a teacher says, William is always so helpful with classmates when they're stuck on a problem, I'll highlight it and say, I see this too in our house. And we save those just so that our kids could see over time how their strengths have always been there and developed.
I think it's interesting too that when kids are just going through their days, the only way that they feel evaluated in terms of their strengths is by grades and kind of comparison with their peers. This peer did this extraordinary extracurricular activity, and I like cooking. Right.
Absolutely.
like the just the kind of social comparison around them. It's not just on social media, although that's a big deal too. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. But also just in real life, every day, think about what their days are. If we went to work every day and someone was giving us grades like that all day long, we were being assessed in those very granular ways, and then given a grade, and you're compared to everybody that you're working with, and it's even on a curve, right? So you're being compared very directly. That is so much pressure. So it's hard for them to see their strengths, because the kinds of things that they're being evaluated on are very specific. It's not who has a good sense of humor, who is a person who really helps their classmates when they're stuck on a problem, as you said, who's the person who's really connects people and brings them together, who's the person that everyone wants to be around. That's not what they're being evaluated on. So I think that's really important. Can we talk a little bit about comparison, and can we talk about social media and comparison as well?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So, when I think about what gets in the way of peer relationships today, right, that healthy interdependence that we really want for our kids, what I found is that we really need to name the elephant in the room, and that's envy. So when you're going to these schools with kids who want sort of the same outcomes and parents who want the same outcomes, it really fosters these environments that where envy is pretty rampant, and left unchecked, it can really hurt and damage relationships. And so one school that I visited actually, talked about envy, talked about comparison, and how it's a natural part of human nature to compare, and we don't have to judge ourselves for that. What we have to judge ourselves on is how we act on those comparisons. So when those feelings of envy bubble up, we can either choose to use a kind of benign envy lens, which is a motivator, and sort of studying how our friend got there and asking them about it and noticing their strengths. Or we could turn to malicious envy, which would make us want to undercut them so that we look better by comparison. We can guide our kids towards a healthy use of social comparison. When I hear about social media, it's certainly an accelerant, and it's certainly a magnifier. What I worry about is that the conversation around social media is getting too simplified. I don't believe it gets to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is this unmet need that our children and the adults in their lives feel, which is they don't feel like they matter for who they are. That is, to me, that is the deep root of this. And when a child is feeling the envy in real life, that child may very well go on social media and use it in not healthy ways. So yes, I think parents should keep an eye on social media. We should be taking an interest in their online worlds as much as we do their lives in real life. But I would caution parents from putting all of their eggs in the social media basket and ignoring other things that could be causing anxiety and stress and depression in their kids.
And maybe part of that is, again, the messaging that this one outcome is not the only outcome.
It's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's widening the definition of success. I mean, it's become so narrow, and it ignores all of the other ways. I want to live a successful life. I am ambitious, but I say to my kids, I'm ambitious for more than just being a good writer and, selling a lot of books. I'm ambitious for my marriage. I want to have a great, relationship with my husband. I'm ambitious with my friendships. I want to have these deep, meaningful friendships. I'm ambitious, with my children. I want to have this strong connection. So I think we need to be ambitious for more. We need to reimagine our ambitions for our children.
You have this great series of questions in the book about how parents can reflect on the pressures that they have in their own homes. Can you share some of those questions with us?
Sure. This was with Tina Payne Bryson, who's a psychoanalyst in California, gave me these 4 questions. She said, look at your child's calendar and what they're doing outside of school. How are they spending their time? 2, look at how you spend your money as it relates to your children. What are you spending a lot of your money on? 3, notice what you ask your child about. And 4, notice what you argue with your child about. So a lot of parents feel like they maybe aren't cranking up the achievement pressure in their home, but those 4 questions could tell you a lot about what your children think about how important achievement is to you.
So 2 of those questions that really resonate in our household are, what do you ask your child about? That's been something that's been a real shift in our family. And I think that a lot of people are starting to think about this more. I think that especially as a therapist, I've heard so many people as adults, young adults, so they're of this generation. So they're just graduating from college now. And they'll say things like, when I would walk in the door, my parents would ask, how was your math test? Right? Or how did that go today? Or how much homework do you have? As opposed to just saying, hi. We don't even think about that. Like, can you imagine walking in the door and being bombarded with a series of questions about your performance that day? And we're doing it out of love. We're doing it like, I want to make sure that everything's going according to plan. So my child is feeling supported, but they're not feeling supported. They're feeling pressure.
Right. So what I now do is I lead with lunch. So when my kids walk in the door, the go-to question for me is, what'd you have for lunch today? Mm-hmm. And what I have come to realize is that when I used to ask about how'd you do on the Spanish quiz or how'd it go in math class, that a lot of it was trying to squelch my own anxieties, worried for them. Did they do okay? And what I have come to realize is our kids are very aware that we want them to achieve. We do not have to pile a knot at home. What we need to do is actually make home a haven from the pressure, a place where they can recover. It does not mean that we don't have standards. It does not mean that we don't, have rules about how work gets done and how much social media or television is played in the home, but that that home really needs to be a place that our kids need to recover from that never enough achievement pressure that they're feeling all day long.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that the fact that we even know that they have a math quiz that day, or, how is it that when, we always like to say when I was growing up, but I think even, 15 years ago, let's say, you probably didn't know everything that was going on in your child's life. And so I've really taken the attitude of, I don't know, when he has a test or a quiz or what's due or an essay due. I'll hear from the teacher, I'll hear when they give their reports. And I think that's how it should be. And I feel like if we do this to our kids now, and your book really supports this, that they're not going to be able to go off into the world and really function as independent adults because they've had someone micromanaging their lives for so long. So we think we're helping them, but actually we're holding them back from doing the work of growing into college life, adulthood, and all of that. So I love in your book that, that question of, what are we asking them about? We shouldn't be asking them about the minutia of their days. We should be saying, hi, how are you? And then just let them, get a snack and whatever they do. And if you're kind of there in the area, but you're not hovering over them, they'll start talking at some point.
Yes.
About things that matter, going back to mattering. So I love that reframe in your book. And the other question about what do we argue about? Most of the arguments, especially later in high school, tend to be about achievement.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I have a senior applying to colleges, and I have become very intentional since researching this book about how often we talk about college or how often we talk about anything related to it. And so one mother that I interviewed made a rule in her home that they would only talk about college on Saturdays for, up to an hour, because then it would open up the rest of the week to enjoying the kid and enjoying this really special time in their life, this last year that they have at home. And so I am very, very aware of it. I think about it. I am aware every day of how often I'm thinking about college. And if I am, I write it down. It's a question we talk about on the weekend.
Yeah. And that's a great strategy. It's like what we do with anxiety. You can write it down and there's a time that you can talk about it. So it's not going to be forgotten. And it does open up. It is the last year. I think a lot of us forget. So many people will say, we had a horrible last year because all we did was fight about college applications. And that's so sad that the last year that your child's in the house, the memories for your child and for you, but also for your child, were of this intense conflict. I don't think that's how we want to send them off into the world. So I love that idea of saving it. Everybody knows we have this hour on the weekend when we can talk about everything college related, and then we don't have to fight about that during the week.
Excellent.
Yeah. And just because we're going to open it up to questions in a minute, I have one last question for you before we do that. You talk about Mark Brackett at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and there's another piece of advice that he gives that I thought would be a nice place to end before we take questions. Can you share that?
Yes. So he says to do this exercise. Think about your child 10 or 20 years from now. Think about the story you want them to tell about their childhood and about you. And then ask yourself if you're helping them tell that story.
That is beautiful.
Powerful. Yeah, it's powerful.
Yeah. Is there anything else that, while we're waiting for questions, is there anything else that surprised you? Because there's so much content in this book, and I really want people to know. First of all, I just want to say again that so I also have a child who's who's just started senior year of high school, and I wish that I'd had this book. It's still extremely useful, probably more useful than I can imagine right now at this time. But I think that even for parents of younger kids, it just gives you this framework. And I wish that I had had this book earlier on. Is there, and you have kids now that, they're older now too. Is there anything in particular, if there was one thing where you say, there are so many things, I'm sure, but if there's one thing that you're saying, I wish that I had known that earlier.
Yes. This is the number one thing I wish I had known earlier. And I think one of the biggest takeaways of the book, next to mattering, the number one intervention for any child in distress, according to decades worth of resilience research, is to make sure the primary caregivers, the adults in that child's life, that their mental health, their support system is intact, because a child's resilience rests fundamentally on the resilience of the adults in their lives. And adult resilience rests on the depth and support of their relationships. So what I wish I had known in the early years was how important it was for me to prioritize my friendships. I am very lucky that I have had friendships that span 30 and 40 years. But there were definitely times when I could have invested more in those friendships so that they could be the critical sources of support for me when I was the first responder to my kids' struggles. So to have someone in my life who at least once a week knew what was going on, so that it's not a put your oxygen mask on first kind of thing. It's having people in your life who know you well enough, who know you're struggling when you're struggling to breathe, and they will put that mask on for you. So that's what I wish I had known. And really one of the major takeaways of the book is parents need to prioritize their relationships, 1-2 friends outside of the home, for the benefit of the people within them.
And that's so important, because so many times we think I have to put all my energy into my child without thinking I need to take care of myself in order to help my child. And we hear that so often, but I love what you said about having people around who will put the mask on you before you are out of breath.
Yes.
And those people, and I think part of that problem is that, and this is why I love this book, and I think it'll bring up so many conversations, is that we, again, don't talk about what our kids are struggling with or how we're struggling with our kids because of this sort of competition culture. And we think that we're failing as parents if either our kid is struggling or we are struggling. And yet everybody who's gone through parenting knows that at some point their kid will struggle, at many points probably they will struggle at many points. And we need to normalize that, and having those outside relationships, those adult relationships, those close friendships, and nurturing those are so important to our stability as parents and our ability to be good parents for our kids. And that's a message that really comes through in your book.
Excellent. And just to be clear, it wasn't that the parents I met in these communities didn't have friends. It was that they didn't invest the time and emotional bandwidth to those relationships so that they could be the deep sources of support. So it's really just about, and I go through it all in the book, but identifying 1 or 2 people in your life that you can carve out an hour a week to Zoom, to meet in person, to be vulnerable, and to allow that person to be vulnerable with you. So we're not talking like upend your whole life and go out every night. It's having 1 or 2 people in your life that know you intimately, who love you unconditionally, the way you try to be there for your own child.
Yeah, absolutely. We have some questions, and I'm going to start with this one. How do you recommend that parents regularly get their kids out of their comfort zones in a healthy way to help them find their sense of purpose?
So finding that sense of purpose is so hard. And I asked William Damon, who is at Stanford, who really has done a ton of research on purpose. And he said, it's something that's hard. You're right that it's a struggle, because I said it was hard for me with my kids. So there are some things we can do. And what I've started implementing in my own house is to, at dinner, when we have family dinners, we talk about genuine needs in the world. We talk about something that's happening in the news or in our neighborhood or with another family, and what can we do as a family to make a small impact. It doesn't have to be huge. One family that I interviewed talked about having a meatless Monday, so that they could, lower the carbon emissions in the environment. And so that was just a way. It's not, everything doesn't have to be purpose with a capital P. Just think of it as helping your children locate genuine needs, and then how to use their strengths, their gifts, their curiosity to fill those needs. And actually, if you head over to the Mattering Movement website, we give tools to help parents find these genuine needs, and teachers and students to find genuine needs in their communities, and how they can help to meet them.
Yeah, and I just want to say the links to all of those, to the Mattering Metric Survey, is in the chat for those of you who are asking. We have another question here. How to help college-age children who are stuck in a failure to launch pattern. We've given him the autonomy we had in the 80s, and they needed a different approach perhaps, and now we all feel stuck. Even when he expresses interest, there's no action on those interests.
So what I would say is Madeline Levine, who is a psychologist in California, said to me, get curious, not furious. When you have a child, an adult child or somebody who's failing to launch, and really dig in. And what I would say, one way to kind of jumpstart that is, and it's reminding me of a conversation I had with a 30-year-old. I was at a corporate event talking about mattering and talking about this book. And the 30-year-old said to me, sometimes I really feel like I don't matter at all. What is there a mantra I can say to myself to get myself out of that headspace? And I said, I have something better than a mantra. I said, go at lunch today to the cafeteria and thank the man or woman who serves you lunch every day, usually with a smile, and say to them, you don't know how this week has been so hard, but seeing you and knowing I'm going to dig into this warm meal and feel your warmth really, is a highlight of my day. So what my advice would be is to help your child unlock mattering in someone else. Are there grandparents that maybe need help with tech, or, reaching out? Is there an elderly neighbor maybe who needs some help? Is there something in the community that you could ask your child to help with? So I think the best way to unlock mattering in ourselves is to unlock mattering in other people.
That's beautiful. And I think so true, that, and the ways in which we can show other people that they matter really helps us to see how we matter. I think we have time for one last question here, which is, how can caregivers calm or redirect a student that is putting pressure on themselves? And I think related to that, when is it okay to let your child quit an activity?
Yeah. So, I think when it comes to, we talk a little bit, I talk in this book about perfectionism. So the researchers who study mattering, one of the leading researchers, Gordon Flett, actually was the researcher who created the perfectionism scale. So his whole career was on this. And what he found was that mattering, helping a child know that they matter aside from their achievements, that they matter for who they are at their core, is a way of calming down perfectionistic tendencies. I mean, for some kids, they are not programmed to understand, well, that's enough for the day, time to shut off my book. And so they need adults in their lives who can put up guardrails. And I do have a whole chapter in the book for that parent that's struggling on confronting grind culture and what the researchers suggest doing.
Right. Well, Jenny, thank you so much. This book, And Never Enough, if you haven't read it yet, you need to pick it up. I, as a therapist, will be recommending this to every parent out there. But I also think I found it relating to myself as an adult. I think so many of the ways we put pressure on ourselves. So thank you for writing this book, and thank you for the conversation today.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for all your wonderful work, Lori.
Laura, you did such a wonderful job. You asked every single question I was going to ask if I'd been given the chance. So it was really right. You're right on top of that. I thought of so many people that you've mentioned. We have Tina Payne Bryson coming on April 16th, returning about how to help your child feel safe, seen, and heard. And Madeline Levine's, those words are drive our mission in GPS, that it's the most important thing that we can do is love the child in front of us, not the child that we hoped for or expected or imagined, but that child. And thinking about Lisa D'Amour when you mentioned her, and you mentioned about having a friend to unload, you know, she talks a lot about how important it is to just let our children unload to us, and then we need someone else to just dump it, as she says. Lori, I have a question for you as a psychologist who's here today. When do I intervene when this toxic culture has just really, I don't want to say destroyed my child, but when do I know? When's the point when I really need to get professional help?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between a kid feeling anxious about something, you know, like this class is making me anxious, as opposed to generalized anxiety. I am anxious all the time about everything. You know, I'm feeling sad because I had a breakup, or I'm feeling sad because this friendship, something happened in the friendship, versus I'm really having trouble getting out of bed. I'm really having trouble functioning. So it's really looking at the global level of functioning. We're always going to feel some anxiety, some sadness. We're going to be angry. We're going to have all kinds of things. But when it's pervasive and it's not ending, that's when I would say it's really time to say something else might be going on here, and let's get some help with that.
Perfect, perfect. It was great to have an investigative reporter take a look at this issue. You know, I remember in 2008, we had the author of a book, Aaron Cooper. He wrote a book, I Just Want My Child to Be Happy, Why You Should Never Say It, Why You Should Never Think It, and What You Should Do Instead. That was 2008. And here we are in 2024. And I wonder when is it enough? When will we understand we just can't not continue to do this to our children? It isn't fair. And so you've shined a light, both of you today are two experts. I couldn't be more delighted. What a treat. Those of you that are here, make a phone call, text someone, tell them to come back. We'll continue the conversation. We've got some books to give away now. This time we'll do a raffle after we say goodbye. And also we'll do that again at 7 p.m. Central Time. So please do share. Ladies, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you
This
so
is
much.
where we go hug the kids if they're around. We'll do that.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
You too. You know, as parents, and this is a new phenomenon, we are one-person villages in our homes because we are so busy. It's not our fault. I'm not blaming us. It's the way life has sort of, you know, we're transplanting, we're following jobs, we're so busy working, and then we're busy intensive parenting. We don't have time to nurture those relationships. But as you point out, the best thing we could do for our kids is to make sure our support system is strong. Because as psychologist Sonia Luthar told me, a child's resilience rests on the resilience of the adults in their lives. And adult resilience rests on the depth and support of our
connections, right?
Exactly.
One of the best things we can do for our kids is to get healthier connections ourselves. When we have the peer support that we need, we're better able to show up for our kids.
Yeah, to be the first responders to our kids' struggles, we need people who can see us, love us, value us unconditionally, that we can be vulnerable to in our lives. And it doesn't take hours a week. Research finds it takes 1 hour of intentional connection, of being vulnerable and having someone who could be vulnerable with us.
Yeah. You know, speaking with Sonia Luthar, who's one of the dominant researchers you cite in this book, because it was her research that really showed us quite surprisingly. She had studied underprivileged kids, underserved kids, and was looking for a control group, studying their mental health, looking for a control group. She chose affluent kids. Turns out the affluent kids were worse off than these, or just as bad off. And she was like, wait a minute, none of us expected that. And this became the foundation of her research, which your work is built upon. And it's such a surprise. We have a funny, not funny, but Heather is asking a question that I'm sure many in the group who don't live in a very urban environment have. You use the phrase elevator line, and people want to know what's an elevator line.
Right.
So briefly describe that for me.
So we live in an apartment building that has 4 different elevator banks. And so an elevator line means that all of our apartments are sort of stacked on top of each other. And so it's easy access to get any supplies or help, or, it's like having neighbors, but the neighbors are one on top of the other.
Okay. I'm glad I asked. I'm glad Heather asked, because I picture just like all the people who wait in line for the elevator, like you. So similar, I guess when you're coming home, it might be that way.
Yep.
Okay. So mattering, you've talked about, you also talked about, we talked about the importance of healthy adults who can be in the kids' lives. And then you said, kids need to be depended on to add value back. And this is where we get to chores or contributing around the house in ways that are less structured than more structured. Michaeline Duclef writes about this beautifully in her book, Hunt, Gather, Parent, which I absolutely love. She writes about how chores are almost like having a family membership card. It's like, it's not punishment. It's not mean. It's like, no, you belong to this family and you contribute in ways that we all find, necessary, and we cherish you for it. So when we think like, oh, they're so busy, they have so many APs, they're on the travel team, they're senior year of high school, they can't, we should just academic. No. That's not the time to take chores away. And you tell a story on this in the book. Like, that's the time to say, no, you still got to mow that lawn. You still got to feed the chickens. You still got to take out the garbage and the recycling, right? Tell us why. Tell us why.
So family is the first introduction to society for a child. And so to learn how to be a contributing, important, significant member of the family gives children the social proof that they matter. So they can hear it in our words that they matter, and they should, but they also need proof that they matter. What is the proof that they matter? For example, my older son, his, family responsibility was to take his younger brother to school. And he had to do that even on Fridays when he had a late class so he could sleep in a little. I needed him to take his brother. So he would take his brother to school. He wasn't always, whistling and happy about it, but he did it because he needed it, because I had to work. He needed to do that for the family. So we talk about chores. I've gone through trying to do chores, and then it became a chore. I've written so much about chores, but what really convinced me about chores is the idea that our kids need to see the proof that they matter, the proof that they can add value to people other than themselves. And it also takes them out of their own brains. They get this other oriented lens, which is very protective for their psychological health.
Right. I mean, we think often when we achieve middle class or upper middle class status or even wealth, we think, why would I give my kid chores when I can hire somebody to do the lawn or to clean the house? We think somehow we're offering them a better life, but we're actually depriving them of the foundational experiences in family life that build work ethic, that build a sense of mattering, right? And that build this sense of there's other things happening in the world besides me and my own needs, which is why so many wealthy families discover their own kids lack the ability to run the family business because they're very self-centered, because they've never been asked to do for others. They don't know how to do anything because, practically speaking, hired others have done it for them, right? So you get this like highly privileged, really underskilled and incapable. And I feel for those. And you saw them in Varsity Blues, frankly. Those kids who said to their parents, who had no idea their parents were cheating on their behalf, they said, why didn't you believe in me? Right? You had to cheat to get me into college. You didn't think that I had any freaking capability. Like, that's who I cried for that day. not the parents hauled off to jail, but the kids who discovered on the morning news that their parents had so little faith in them that they had
Brutal.
cheated on their behalf, right?
Brutal. Brutal.
All right, let's turn to some questions. We've got Emma who's asking a great question. Emma says, how do we support our kids to take air quotes regular courses when they feel those courses don't challenge them quite enough and the school they're at is pushing for the kids to take all the AP classes?
Right. So I actually have an entire chapter in the book called Resisting Grind Culture, where I met with families that really put up bumpers on what they allowed their kids to do. So they would look at the schedules, they would look at the course schedule and say, no, you can't take 2 AP sciences. No, you can't do this. And actually the families that helped their kids figure out how to live a balanced life, those kids actually did well. I don't know, could they have done better in the short term? Maybe, but what I saw so much on the ground was that when parents indulged the child's, want to really overschedule themselves, and so the kids were depriving themselves of sleep, what happened on the weekends is a lot of those kids were abusing substances, not 1 or 2 drinks, but to drink to blackout. And so what I've come to realize in researching this book is that it's really a critical job of a parent to teach our children how to create a life they don't have to escape from. And the way we do that is we put up guardrails and we say, these are things you have to do. You have to get 9 hours of sleep. You have to have family time. Yeah, Challenge Success has a great phrase: playtime, downtime, and family time, PDF, that every child, and I would argue every adult, needs to have in their life daily. And so anyway, the whole chapter on resisting grind culture.
So, resisting the peer pressure though, like how do
you do that? So the families that I met and what's worked in my own life is having 1 or 2 people who share my values, who can remind me when I say, literally, I made this phone call once to my friend Katie. I said, remind me why I'm not doing travel soccer. And she said, because you want to have family time. You don't want to be fractured running around. So that's more important to you. And so anyway, so it's having people remind you of your values, of helping you to stay on course.
And you know what? In the book, you even quote someone who said, you really want to fix things, move.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And you were like, yeah, but not really. And they were like, no, why don't we actually interrogate that option? Why are we so hell bent on our kid being in this school, our living in this community? That gets back to our own ego. Like, no. But I believe this community, despite its toxicity for children, is actually a great place to live. Like, wait a minute. I mean, sometimes I tell people here in Palo Alto, the heart of Silicon Valley, where our youth suicide rate is, well beyond the national average. I mean, why are we not running for the hills? Why are we not running in search of where healthy communities still exist? Why do we somehow not see the degree of strain and the languishing or the, what did you call it? You were talking about how kids, I'm not gonna be able to find it quickly. You used a word that began with L to describe how our kids feel. It's not lackluster. Oh, heck. Now I'm down this rabbit hole. I'm like flipping through the book, looking for the word, but just to describe the, how it feels to have these, listless.
Oh, yeah.
His worldview, I'm like writing in your book. Like,
oh, Julie.
Right. His worldview was so different, like the kid who, Adam, tell about Adam.
My God, Adam. I love Adam.
Because Adam went from listless to like totally loving life.
Yeah. So Adam was a student who was in a high achieving community. He went to a public school. He was severely dyslexic. And so, started high school out not really challenging himself because he didn't know how much he could take on. And then had a really pivotal experience in his life as a member of search and rescue. He was tasked to find the body of a boy his age near a waterfall. And he did that. And that moment completely changed him and changed his trajectory. And he said, I now have a purpose. I want to help prevent suicide. I want to get these conversations going. And it's just set him on this positive upward spiral to the point where he's now at UCLA on a pre-med track. And he's like, yeah, my dyslexia is really hard to do a lot of the math. But it's not about me. It's about something greater than myself. I want to be an emergency room doctor. I want to help people in distress. And so he is an extraordinary example of how, and it doesn't have to be as big a purpose as he found, right? That's really unique and amazing at his age that he found that. It could be a small p purpose. It could be, what can I do? Where can I make a positive impact in my world? So anyway, Adam is an extraordinary example of how we can turn around listlessness and the mattering by finding ways of unlocking mattering in others. It unlocks it in ourselves. So for Adam, unlocking mattering in others meant listening to people's stories. He joined a hotline to help, a suicide hotline. He was showing people that they mattered, that they were worthy of support. And that made him feel like he mattered.
Yeah. For those who are finding that concept intriguing, I just want to add, I have a hotline, 1-877 Hi Julie, which is it's literally a red phone from college. I'm just going to grab it. And you call it and I listen, and people are like, why do you do that? And I'm like, well, because I've read that we're all so desperate to just know someone cares. And so I listen, and people just tell me about their lives. And I don't get back to that. They leave me a voicemail, and I listen. And I have a weekly group on my online blog, Julie's Pod, where it's just a coffee hangout like this on Zoom, where I give a prompt that allows people to share something vulnerable. This is my attempt to do what Sunia Luthar is doing, creating groups where people can like 12-step, just for life, like not, they're valid 12-step programs for various addictions. This is just like, come together with a group of strangers and let's talk about what's on our plate today, or let's talk about, some difficulty we're having with family or whatever it might be. And it's my attempt to just be one tiny piece of the solution, for people who are in my life. Let me read a comment from Holly, who I think was responding when I told about my concerns about Sawyer in college and like not being, I had to say like, he's only taking a year off, and people were like, really, Julie, Holly says, this was my son after his second year of engineering at Arizona State. I wanted him to stay in school for me. I had to take myself out of the situation, Holly says. She says, he took a year off. He worked as a FedEx driver, realized he didn't want that. And now he's back in school in the same program and is knocking it out of the park. I had to let him experience life without me directing it. It was hard for me to do, but ultimately he learned his own lesson in life and what he wants. And he ended back where he left. He just needed to learn what he wanted on his own path. Holly, we are happy for you. We're happy for your son. Thank you for sharing that example with us all. We have another question here from Cheryl. Cheryl asks, in looking at gap year programs, there seems to be a similar sense of pressure and achievement, just like applying to college. I'm wondering how exploring a gap year could be an antidote to pressure to get into the perfect college. What should we look for or seek to structure without getting caught up in a whole different kind of rat race?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think what I found when I was digging through the research about what is a good fit on college, I think what you're asking is what's a good fit when it comes to a gap year. And so what I would tell you is over prestige, right? Fit over prestige. Fit would mean finding a program where your child will feel valued, will be able to use whatever strengths they have in that program, and be able to get the social proof that they are adding value to others. So instead of looking at what's the most prestigious, I would say look for the best fit in a program. Where will that child feel valued? Where will they have an opportunity to add meaningful value to others? That to me, I think a gap year is an extraordinary idea
And I think there's the value in unstructured time for these kids of ours who are 18, 19, 20, right? They could be in the military. They're not, they're finished high school and they're feeling listless or they lack purpose, right? Literally today, I got an email from a dad in my town saying our son just completed 2 years at community college and now he's gotten into one of the UCs here in California, the University of California system, one of the more prestigious schools in that system. And he said he's just going to be a reluctant econ major because he's really not interested in anything. And we realize we've never, like what can we do to support our kid? And I just found myself saying, like this may be hard to hear, but that my suggestions are sort of might seem radical to you, but I said, he sounds like he's lacking in purpose and for good reasons, I'm sure. But I might tell him, son, I'm not going to pay for 4-year college, until you're excited to go. You don't have to go. No one's making you. And in fact, it's a waste of your time and our money if you're just like, well, I guess I'll be an econ major because I'm not interested in anything. Like, no. Okay, we're not sending you to college until you're delighted. In the meantime, work full-time or part-time work and part-time serve the community. And we're going to hold you to that. You can still live with us. That's the good news. And you're going to get a job and or volunteer to serve others. Not to punish you, but that's how we think you're going to find yourself. And that was one suggestion for this dad. The second suggestion was, and I think I might have gotten this advice from Rick Weisbord, quite honestly, although maybe not. Somebody smart and male told me one of the best things we can do for our kids when we are middle class or upper middle class and have some money saved is say, you know what, you've graduated high school, you're not ready to go to college, you're not even sure that's what you want. I'm going to give you $5,000. You're going to go to Europe. I'm going to pay for that flight. I'm going to give you $5,000 or $3,000, pick some few thousands. You're going to go there, stay as long as you can on the amount of money you have. Okay. Be resourceful, frugal, read maps, talk to strangers, solve problems, call us when you're out of money and we will buy you a ticket home. In other words, being by yourself, out of your comfort zone, in a community, a continent that is well networked with trains, that is very walkable and very trainable. Like, go figure it out. Go figure it out, kid. We're confident you can. Kelly Corrigan and I have talked about this. Like, our daughters have both had disasters happen in Europe. Oh, I missed my train. They text us, right? I missed my train. Okay, I love you so much. Let me know how you handled it. Love you. I can't fix it. I'm in California and you're in Portugal and just had your passport stolen. I feel for you, my child. But if I do anything other than compassion and confidence that you can solve it, I am undermining your ability to solve it, right? Yeah. They need more of those kinds of experiences.
I wish we had some sort of national mandate where kids had to, just as being part of an American, you have to give back in some way to an underserved community. And that was just normed, that's just what kids do. I mean, I think, we don't have a military, like Israel, where everybody has to serve, just something where we have to add value, where we are tasked with adding value to our society.
Agreed. So, why don't we're coming up on the hour here. I want you to talk about this being of use to others, because as it turns out, that's going to be everything. Having some kind of purpose that is outwardly directed, that isn't about my grades, my performance, my class rank, right? Give us like a couple of examples of what that might look like and why it matters.
Well, so one thing that free resources that we have for parents is on a nonprofit I co-founded, which is sort of the action arm of the book. It's called the matteringmovement.com. And what we have on there it's called the Mattering Project. So what it does is it teaches kids how to locate and find genuine needs in the community. So not what you think somebody needs, but what do they genuinely need? Go in and look and give them what they need. You talk with them. So there are tools there for students to start their own mattering projects. families can adopt it as something they're doing as a family on the weekends, free resources for teachers. So I would recommend everybody head over, get the book, understand mattering, and then go over to the mattering mindset, the mattering movement. And yeah, and it's a clearinghouse. We also have the Mattering Institute, where we have all of the leading researchers, not all of them, but many of the leading researchers on mattering, all in one place to have all of the information that somebody might need, and lots of free resources.
Y'all, I just pulled it up and I'm stunned. Like, I've written books, but I have not had companion websites to start movements. So massive applause to you. Check out the matteringmovement.com. Let me just acknowledge Jeannie Sai in the chat is thanking you for sharing your insights. Her 11th grader son is dealing with a steep learning curve between sophomore and junior year. So she says this is super timely. Gonna do my best to follow all your advice. And she's a local person for me here in the Silicon Valley area, and is saying she's excited for me to come to MVLA in October, and I can't wait. Yes. And Maria says, thank you both. Such important and needed information for all parents. So grateful to have found this series. Yes, Glenbard Parent Series, and have joined the meeting today. Love the suggestion to imagine your kids 20 years from now. What story do you want them to tell about you and their childhood? Then ask yourself, are you helping your kids to tell that story? Let me just give you the opportunity to say what you haven't yet said, Jennifer. The floor is yours.
I just want to say thank you so much, Julie, for bringing so much compassion and wisdom to these, the problems that we are all feeling. And so what I hope parents or educators leave tonight, knowing that you are not alone. We are all feeling this. And it revealed itself in the stories that I listened to, the families that I met, the surveys I did. We are all feeling this in one way or another, and wrestling with this never enough feeling, even as adults. So join us. Let's put mattering front and center in our lives. Unlock it in our kids, unlock it in ourselves, unlock it in our neighbors.
Once again, two incredible women inspiring us, and with these insights that that we have to react. We have to help these kids. Julie, when so many years ago, you reminded me, sometimes you have to hear something over and over and over until it sinks in. But until I heard you say that we deny our children the opportunity to feel good about their success when we are in there and it's our success, that really stayed with me. So I really, really thank you for that. You talked about, in the beginning of the book, you start off about a young lady who was running with her eyes closed. That's how exhausted she was. What a visual that is. Will you quickly tell us about the $20 bill? You described. Yeah.
So a mother that I interviewed had two children who were very hard on themselves. And so she would do this exercise whenever they'd come home with a bad grade or get cut from the team. She'd reach into her wallet and she would grab whatever bill she had, a $5 bill, 10, 20, and she would hold it up to her child and she would say, do you want this $20 bill? Then she would wrinkle it up, put it on the floor, dirty it, dunk it in a glass of water. And then she would hold up this dirty, soggy, wrinkled bill. And she would say to her children, just like this bill, your worth doesn't change. Whether you are cut from the team, whether you feel crumpled up inside, your worth is your worth no matter what. And it is just something that needs to be a daily reminder for our children and for ourselves and for our friends. I mean, that's what's so critical, that why adults need this support. We need to be reminded that we matter. We need to be reminded of this. Nobody matters in isolation. We matter when we're in connection with each other.
This afternoon, you were introduced by Amber Quirk, our superintendent for DuPage County. Your website about mattering is going to be so valuable. In DuPage County, the western suburbs of Chicago, there is a website called givingdupage.org where a child can put in their interests and then find a place to learn how to matter. This afternoon, the last thing I'm going to say, we talked about Madeline Levine, and that really, her words drive much of what we do here about loving the child in front of you. It bears repeating every single time we get together. Not the child that you dreamt about, expected, imagined, hoped for that child. That's our child. How lucky are we? And this is where we go hug the children. Oh, thank you so much, ladies. What a wonderful evening. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Hilda. Thanks, everybody.